In the cold, unforgiving depths of space where entire civilizations were swept aside by ruthless predators, a lone human became an unlikely shield for the helpless. Mark Delaney, a drifter haunted by his own demons, found himself trapped on a desolate outpost with a dozen alien cubs, the last survivors of Suspenseful's hunt. As galactic predators closed in, he faced a choice that would echo across the stars: run and save himself or fight against the impossible to protect lives that weren't his own. What followed was a battle that would transform a man into a legend. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, a forgotten outpost lay dormant, swallowed by the vast and silent void. It was a relic of an age that had long since passed, its metallic walls corroded and scarred by time. The structure floated aimlessly in orbit around a desolate planet, its purpose erased from the databanks of galactic history. Inside, the hallways were dark and lifeless, illuminated only by the flickering remnants of ancient lights that cast eerie shadows across the cold floors. This place had been abandoned, its secrets left to rot in obscurity. Mark awoke to the suffocating silence. The stale air clawed at his lungs, and a deep ache throbbed through his body as he stirred from unconsciousness. His vision swam, and his thoughts were a tangled mess of fragmented memories. Images of Earth chaotic, burning, and lost flashed through his mind, though the details were vague. He was a soldier. That much he remembered. A protector. But how he had come to be here in this forgotten corner of the galaxy was a question that gnawed at his sanity. The room around him was small and sparsely furnished, likely a living quarter from the outpost's active days. A faint hum of dormant machinery vibrated through the walls, a constant reminder that the station, though abandoned, was not entirely dead. He sat up slowly, wincing as his muscles protested, and tried to orient himself. The only light came from a flickering overhead panel, its faint glow barely piercing the heavy shadows. Mark's instincts kicked in. Years of training in survival and combat had taught him to assess his surroundings quickly and methodically. He scanned the room, noting the skeletal remains of what might have been a console, now nothing more than a corroded shell. There were no immediate threats, but the oppressive atmosphere hinted at danger lurking just beyond his sight. As he stepped out of the room, his boots echoed against the metallic floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The outpost stretched before him, its labyrinthine corridors leading into darkness. The air carried a faint metallic tang, a mix of rust and decay. Each step he took seemed heavier than the last, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. Then he heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a whimper, soft and fleeting, as though carried on the dying breath of the station itself. Mark froze, his senses sharpened, and listened intently. The sound came again, faint but distinct, echoing from deeper within the outpost. His heart quickened, not with fear, but with a strange, inexplicable urgency. Following the sound, he moved cautiously through the corridors, his every sense on high alert. The faint whimper grew louder as he approached a heavy door at the end of a long hallway. It took all his strength to pry it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the sight that greeted him was unlike anything he had ever seen. A cluster of small creatures huddled together, their fragile forms trembling in the dim light. They were alien, with soft luminescent fur that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the shadows. Their large, glistening eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity as they regarded him. They were clearly young, their small bodies barely able to support their weight. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene. These creatures were no threat. They were helpless, vulnerable, and terrified. The question of what had driven them into hiding haunted him as he knelt slowly, trying not to startle them. They flinched at his movement but did not flee, their wide eyes locked on his every gesture. In that moment, something stirred deep within Mark, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Despite the emptiness of the outpost and the questions surrounding his own presence, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't leave them. Whatever had brought him here, whatever had driven these cubs into hiding, didn't matter. All that mattered now was protecting them. Mark stood motionless, staring at the fragile beings huddled before him. Their glowing fur shimmered faintly, an almost ethereal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their shallow breaths. The cubs were unlike anything he had encountered during his time as a soldier, but their vulnerability was unmistakable. They clung to one another, their tiny forms trembling as they stared up at him with wide, glistening eyes. He took a tentative step forward, lowering himself to their level in a gesture of calm. The cubs flinched but did not scatter, their fear outweighed by exhaustion. They had been here for some time. He realized their thin frames a testament to deprivation. Whatever had left them in this state had also left them utterly alone until now. Mark scanned the chamber, taking in the scattered remnants of what might have once been a nursery. The walls were adorned with faded markings, perhaps the language or art of their species, but time had rendered them almost unreadable. Broken equipment lay strewn about, some of it scorched, as if by fire or energy weapons. This place had been a haven for these creatures once, but had been violently torn apart. His military instincts told him to assess the situation logically, to gather facts and form a plan. But as he looked back at the cubs, all that training seemed secondary. Their soft whimpers tugged at something deeper, a primal need to protect those who could not protect themselves. For a moment, the memories of Earth faded. The burning cities, the collapsing skies, the endless chaos of war, all of it dimmed in the face of the immediate reality before him. He crouched lower, careful to move slowly, and extended his hand. One of the cubs, braver than the rest, took a hesitant step forward. Its delicate paws patted across the cold floor, and it sniffed at his outstretched fingers. Its luminescent eyes studied him, as if trying to determine his intentions. When it finally leaned into his hand, pressing its soft fur against his skin, the others began to follow. Mark felt a swell of emotion as the cubs gathered around him, their trust fragile but unmistakable. He didn't know their species, their origins, or even what had attacked them, but he understood the weight of their silent plea. They needed him. Rising carefully, Mark surveyed the room again, searching for anything useful. He found a few containers of what looked like nutrient packs, perhaps food for the cubs, though it was alien to him. He placed the packs near them, watching as they cautiously approached and began to eat. The way they devoured the contents told him they had been starving. As the cubs ate, Mark began to notice faint marks on their fur, scratches, bruises, and burns. The realization hit him like a blow. These weren't the results of an accident or natural disaster. Someone or something had hunted them, forcing them into this desperate state. He had no answers, only a growing sense of urgency. Whatever had driven them into hiding was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until its task was complete. Mark knew he couldn't stay in the safety of this chamber. The cubs needed more than food. They needed protection. Gathering a few supplies from the room, he fashioned a makeshift sling to carry the weakest among them. The others, though unsteady, followed closely as he began to lead them out of the chamber. Each step was careful, calculated, as he guided them through the winding corridors of the outpost. The outpost, once a place of safety for these creatures, now felt like a labyrinth of dangers. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every distant sound a prelude to an attack. Yet Mark pressed on, his resolve growing with every step. As the cubs clung to him and followed his lead, Mark felt a faint glimmer of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. For now, these fragile lives depended entirely on him. Mark moved through the cold, metallic corridors of the outpost, the cubs trailing behind him like fragile shadows. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft patter of their small feet against the floor. He kept his senses sharp, scanning every corner and darkened alcove for signs of danger. There was no telling what still lurked in the outpost's depths, but the marks on the cubs told him all he needed to know: something had hunted them, and it could return at any moment. The dim lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows that made the environment feel alive. The outpost systems were failing, and the air tasted stale, a mix of rust and old machinery. It was a place on the brink of collapse, and yet Mark had no choice but to navigate its crumbling halls. The cubs had no means of escape on their own, and he wasn't about to leave them to their fate. As they moved deeper into the outpost, the faint hum of machinery gave way to an eerie quiet. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mark's instincts screamed at him to stay alert, and he tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon he had fashioned earlier, a length of pipe scavenged from the debris. The cubs remained close, their luminous fur a faint glow in the gloom. They seemed to sense his tension, their tiny bodies quivering with unease. Every so often, one would pause and glance behind them, its wide eyes scanning the darkness. It wasn't fear of the unknown that chilled Mark. It was the growing certainty that the cubs weren't the only ones being hunted. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a distant, almost imperceptible noise that echoed through dark corridors. A scraping, metallic hiss like claws dragging along steel. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. The cubs huddled closer, their whimpers barely audible. He turned slowly, scanning the hallway behind them. The flickering light made it impossible to see far, but the sound persisted, growing louder. It wasn't random. It had rhythm, purpose. Something was moving and it was getting closer. Mark gestured for the cubs to move, urging them forward. He quickened his pace, careful not to make too much noise, but the hunters or whatever they were weren't far behind. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn leading to another identical passage. The outpost had become a labyrinth, and Mark felt the walls closing in around him. The sound of scraping grew louder, more insistent. Mark's mind raced. He needed a plan. Stumbling upon an old storage room, he ushered the cubs inside and barricaded the door with whatever he could find. The space was small and cluttered, filled with broken machinery and discarded crates. He crouched low, holding the pipe tightly as he positioned himself between the cubs and the door. His heart pounded in his chest. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The cubs clung to one another, their faint glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. The scraping sound stopped just outside the door. Mark held his breath, straining to hear. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until a sudden sharp impact made the door shudder. Something was out there, testing the barrier. Another blow followed, louder this time, the door groaning under the pressure. Mark's grip tightened, his resolve hardening. He wasn't sure what was on the other side, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let it get to the cubs. They had already endured too much, and whatever hunted them would have to go through him first. The blows continued, relentless and precise. The cubs whimpered, their fear palpable, but Mark didn't waver. His breath steadied, his mind focusing. If this was the moment he had to fight, so be it. The creatures wouldn't find easy prey here. When the final blow came, splintering the barricade, Mark was ready. The door gave way with a deafening crash, shards of metal and debris flying into the room. Mark braced himself, the improvised weapon firm in his hands, as the cubs huddled tightly in the farthest corner. The intruder stepped through the jagged opening, and the sight of it froze the breath in Mark's lungs. It was massive, easily twice his size, with a chitinous body that gleamed under the faint, flickering light. Its limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and its elongated head bore an array of black, soulless eyes that glinted with a predatory focus. The creature moved with a disturbing fluidity, each step deliberate and menacing. Its body seemed designed for one purpose: to kill. Mark stood his ground, his every nerve screaming at him to flee, but he forced the instinct down. He wasn't fighting for himself. The cubs, still trembling behind him, were utterly defenseless. If he faltered, they wouldn't stand a chance. The predator let out a guttural hiss, its mandibles clicking as it advanced. Mark shifted his weight, preparing for the attack. He had faced death before, but never like this, never in such close quarters, against an enemy so alien and so utterly lethal. The creature lunged, its claws slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Mark dodged to the side, the movement instinctive, and swung the pipe with all his strength. The impact landed against the creature's carapace, a dull clang that barely phased it. The predator turned on him with alarming speed, its claws raking across his chest. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but Mark didn't let it slow him down. He struck again, aiming for the creature's legs, hoping to disrupt its balance. This time, the pipe connected with a joint, and the predator stumbled slightly, letting out a shriek of rage. The fight became a blur of motion. The predator's attacks were relentless, its claws carving through the air with precision, while Mark ducked, dodged, and countered as best he could. Each swing of his weapon felt heavier than the last, his strength waning as the adrenaline coursed through him. A particularly brutal swipe sent him sprawling against the wall, the breath knocked from his lungs. The predator loomed over him, its claws poised for the killing blow. Mark's mind raced, searching for any possible advantage. His eyes darted to the room's contents, a jumble of broken machinery and discarded tools. In a split second, he spotted it, an exposed power conduit sparking faintly near the wall. As the predator struck, Mark rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the lethal claws. He grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the debris and jammed it into the exposed conduit, sending a surge of electricity arcing toward the creature. The predator let out an ear-piercing screech as the electricity coursed through its body, its limbs convulsing uncontrollably. Mark scrambled to his feet, using the momentary distraction to strike again, this time with everything he had. He drove the pipe into the weakened joint he had targeted earlier, and with a sickening crack, the limb gave way. The creature collapsed, its movements erratic and weakened, but it wasn't finished. Mark knew this was his only chance. With a final, desperate effort, he grabbed a heavy piece of machinery and brought it down on the predator's head. The impact was decisive, and the creature fell still, its body twitching once before going limp. Mark stood over the fallen predator, his chest heaving and his body trembling from the exertion. Blood trickled from the gashes on his chest, and every muscle ached, but he was alive. He turned to the cubs, who were staring at him with wide, awestruck eyes. Though the fight had ended, Mark knew the danger wasn't over. The predator was dead, but it wouldn't be the only one. Something had sent it here, and others would likely follow. He couldn't stay in the outpost any longer. The cubs needed to be taken somewhere safe, and he was their only hope. The aftermath of the battle left Mark drained but resolute. The predator's corpse lay crumpled on the floor, a grotesque reminder of the dangers that still loomed. The flickering light overhead reflected off the creature's jagged carapace, casting distorted shadows across the room. Mark forced himself to push the fear aside and focus on the task at hand. Survival meant moving quickly. They couldn't stay here any longer. The cubs had crept closer, their glowing forms quivering as they peered at the fallen predator. Mark knelt down, wiping sweat and blood from his face, and gestured for them to follow. Their trust in him, fragile as it had been, now seemed absolute. Despite their fear, they clung to his presence as a source of safety. Mark scavenged what he could from the room. Among the scattered debris, he found a small portable power unit, likely still functional. It wasn't much, but it could be a lifeline if they encountered more trouble. He also spotted a rusted storage container with a few nutrient packs, scarce but better than nothing. His movements were swift and methodical. Every second spent here was a risk. With the cubs in tow, Mark left the room and re-entered the dimly lit corridors of the outpost. The air seemed heavier now, thick with the scent of burnt circuitry and blood. The battle had likely echoed through the station, and if there were more predators, they would have heard it. The thought of another encounter sent a chill down his spine, but he pressed on. The outpost's layout was a maze, its corridors winding endlessly with no clear direction. Mark's only guide was the faint hum of energy emanating from deeper within the structure. He reasoned that following it might lead to a central hub, possibly a way to escape or send a distress signal. The cubs kept pace as best they could, their small bodies clearly fatigued. Mark occasionally carried the weakest of them, their soft fur warm against his arms. The others followed closely, their luminescent glow casting faint light onto the walls. Despite the dire circumstances, their presence gave him a strange sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving for himself anymore, he was their shield, their hope. As they moved, the corridors began to change. The walls, once uniform and metallic, became more heavily damaged. Sections of the ceiling had collapsed, and scorch marks lined the surfaces, evidence of past violence. Mark's unease grew with every step. This wasn't just an abandoned outpost, it had been a battleground. Then he saw a jagged hole in the side of the corridor, leading into the void of space. Beyond the breach, the stars stretched infinitely, cold and unfeeling. The realization struck him hard. The outpost wasn't just abandoned. It had been attacked, systematically and ruthlessly. Mark quickened his pace, his eyes scanning for signs of functional systems. His hope lay in the possibility that some part of the outpost's infrastructure might still be active. If he could find a functioning terminal or even a navigation console, he could plot an escape route. As they rounded a corner, the faint hum grew louder, guiding them to a large, reinforced door. Mark hesitated, his instincts warning him to proceed with caution. The door looked intact, its surface unmarred by the destruction that plagued the rest of the outpost. If anything beyond it was still operational, it could be their salvation or their doom. Gathering his courage, Mark approached the console beside the door. The controls were unfamiliar, clearly designed for a species far removed from humanity, but he recognized the universal logic of engineering. With a few calculated guesses, he activated the mechanism, and the door slid open with a hiss. What lay beyond took his breath away. The room was vast, filled with humming machinery and illuminated by a soft, bluish light. At its center was a console that looked operational, its screens flickering with alien symbols. But what truly caught his attention was the spacecraft docked at the far end of the chamber. It was small, built for speed rather than comfort, but it was intact. Mark felt a flicker of hope. If he could power it up and secure the cubs inside, they might have a chance to escape this nightmare. But the moment of relief was fleeting. A low, guttural growl echoed from the corridor behind them. Mark turned, his grip tightening on his makeshift weapon, as the shadows stirred once more. The hunt wasn't over. The growl that emanated from the corridor was low and resonant, vibrating through the floor beneath Mark's boots. He didn't need to see the source to understand the danger. It was a sound that spoke of predation, of something that had evolved to kill. He glanced at the cubs, their glowing fur dimming as they instinctively pressed themselves against the walls, trying to disappear into the shadows. Mark had no time to waste. He scanned the chamber quickly, eyes darting between the spacecraft and the central console. The ship was their only chance, but it wouldn't be simple. Whatever power systems remained in the outpost might not extend to the docking bay, and starting an alien craft would require every ounce of ingenuity and luck he had. The growl grew louder, now accompanied by the scrape of claws against metal. Whatever was coming, it was getting closer, and it wasn't alone. The echoing sounds told him there were at least two, maybe more. His pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his focus. Mark herded the cubs toward the spacecraft, motioning for them to stay close to its ramp. The little ones obeyed, their trust in him unwavering despite their fear. He sprinted toward the console in the center of the chamber, its alien interface glowing faintly. The symbols on the screen were incomprehensible, but their patterns suggested a logic, a sequence he could manipulate. His fingers moved quickly, testing combinations, searching for anything that would indicate a power transfer to the ship. The screen pulsed in response, the symbols shifting as the console emitted a low hum. Mark's heart leapt when he saw lights flicker on the spacecraft's hull. It was operational, or at least partially so. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. A heavy thud echoed through the chamber as the first predator appeared, its massive frame silhouetted in the dim light. This one was larger than the creature he had faced before, its body scarred from countless battles. It paused at the entrance, sniffing the air, its multiple eyes locking onto Mark with chilling precision. The second predator emerged moments later, slightly smaller but no less menacing. The two creatures spread out, their movements synchronized as they advanced. Mark gritted his teeth and slammed another sequence of commands into the console. The ship's engines sputtered to life, their deep whine filling the chamber. The predators reacted instantly, their focus shifting to the ship. They moved with terrifying speed, claws clattering against the floor as they charged. Mark grabbed a nearby piece of debris, a jagged metal rod, and hurled it at the closest creature. It deflected harmlessly off its carapace, but the distraction bought him a precious second. He sprinted toward the ship, yelling for the cubs to move up the ramp. The smallest ones stumbled, their tiny legs struggling to keep pace, but they managed to clamber aboard. Mark reached the ramp just as the first predator lunged. He spun, swinging his pipe with all his strength. The impact caught the creature across its jaw, staggering it but not stopping its momentum. Mark scrambled backward into the ship, slamming his fist against the control panel near the entrance. The ramp began to rise, the hydraulic systems groaning under the strain. The larger predator clawed at the edge, its talons scraping against the metal as it tried to pull itself inside. Mark grabbed a loose cargo crate and shoved it against the creature, using every ounce of strength to force it back. The predator roared, its massive claws slicing through the crate as it fell. The ramp sealed with a final hiss, cutting off the creature's enraged growls. Inside the ship, the cubs huddled together, their glowing fur dim but steady. Mark staggered to the cockpit, blood dripping from his wounds and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The controls were alien, covered in symbols he couldn't read, but their layout suggested functionality. He scanned the panels, searching for anything resembling a flight sequence. The ship shuddered as something slammed against its hull. The predators weren't giving up, their relentless assault continuing even as Mark worked to activate the craft. Finally, he found a lever that seemed to correspond to propulsion. With a desperate pull, he engaged it. The engines roared to full power, and the ship lifted from the ground. Mark felt the shift in gravity as the craft ascended, its thrusters pushing against the docking bay floor. Through the viewport, he saw the outpost falling away, the predators growing smaller as the ship broke free from the station's gravity well. Relief flooded him, but it was fleeting. They were free of the outpost, but they were far from safe. The predators might not have been the only threat lurking in the cold void of space. The spacecraft surged into the darkness of space, leaving the battered outpost and its deadly inhabitants far behind. Mark slumped into the pilot's seat, his body aching from the fight and the desperate escape. The hum of the engines was steady, a reassuring sound that marked their survival for now. Behind him, the cubs huddled together in the small confines of the cabin, their glowing fur flickering faintly like embers in the void. He turned his attention to the controls, scanning the alien symbols on the panels. The ship's propulsion systems were functional, but beyond that, he couldn't determine its capabilities. The navigation interface was a mystery, and he had no way of knowing where they were headed. Mark felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Out here, drifting in uncharted space, survival wasn't guaranteed. The cubs let out soft, chirping sounds, their fear gradually giving way to a tentative calm. Mark turned to them and saw their wide eyes watching him with a mixture of awe and trust. The smallest of the group edged closer, curling up near his feet, its faint glow casting gentle light on the floor. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of warmth. He had protected them, and they were alive because of it. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sharp beep from the console drew his attention. One of the monitors flashed with a series of unfamiliar symbols, accompanied by a pulsating red light. Mark's pulse quickened. He didn't need to understand the language to know what it meant. They had been detected. The ship shuddered slightly, and through the viewport he saw a faint glimmer in the distance, a vessel approaching rapidly. Its sleek, angular design and the ominous red glow of its lights marked it as hostile. Mark's mind raced. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to offer help. The cubs sensed the tension, their glowing forms dimming as they pressed closer together. Mark scanned the ship's controls, searching desperately for anything that resembled defensive systems. He found a panel with what appeared to be targeting reticles and toggled a switch. A faint hum reverberated through the ship as external turrets powered up. The pursuing vessel didn't wait. Bright streaks of energy surged toward them, barely missing as Mark jerked the controls to evade. The ship's movements were sluggish, its design clearly not optimized for combat. Another blast grazed the hull, and alarms blared through the cabin. Mark gritted his teeth, his focus narrowing to the console in front of him. He activated the turrets, aiming blindly and firing bursts of plasma. The shots scattered across the void, forcing the enemy ship to swerve. It wasn't enough to disable it, but it bought him a few precious seconds. He spotted a dense asteroid field ahead, a labyrinth of rock and debris suspended in the void. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was his only chance. He veered the ship toward it, the engines straining as he pushed them to their limit. The hostile vessel followed, its weapons continuing to fire. The ship plunged into the asteroid field, weaving through narrow gaps and avoiding massive chunks of rock. Mark's hands were steady on the controls, his instincts honed by years of surviving impossible odds. The pursuing ship wasn't as agile, its larger frame struggled to maneuver through the tight spaces. As Mark guided the ship deeper into the field, he spotted an opportunity, a massive asteroid with a hollowed core, its entrance barely large enough for his ship. He accelerated, aiming for the narrow opening. The hostile vessel followed, its weapons firing relentlessly. At the last moment, Mark swerved sharply, diving into the asteroid's core. The hostile ship attempted to follow but miscalculated, its hull scraping against the asteroid's jagged edges. A massive explosion lit up the void as the vessel collided with the rocky surface, obliterating it in a fiery burst. Mark's ship emerged on the other side, battered but intact. He exhaled deeply, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The cubs chirped softly, their glow returning as they sensed the danger had passed. The vastness of space stretched before them, an endless expanse of stars and possibilities. Mark set the ship to autopilot and leaned back, his mind already calculating their next move. He didn't know where they would go or what other dangers awaited, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. The Cubs had entrusted their lives to him, and he had become their guardian. In the depths of space, where survival was a daily battle, Mark had forged a bond stronger than blood. He was no longer just a man running from his past, he was a protector, a legend in the making. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizons stories for more thrilling tales of science fiction and adventure.